Welcome to Chain Reaction, the Foreign Policy Research Institute's flagship network of podcast series examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping Europe and Eurasia. Throughout the year, we're talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, the past, present, and future of the Baltic states, Russia's political economy, and great power competition in the region. Join us each month for
Bear Market Brief.
The understanding of Russia, which is broadly as Russia as a great power that has its own special path, that has a mission, and that needs a strong state, and a different path to that of the West.
I think when you look at these other industries, what you find is that there's a lot of pain built up in different parts of the Russian economy. Some of it's only going to be felt over a longer period of time.
Baltic ways.
There were the countries that when the war started, they were willing to be, those voices of moral conscience.
The continent.
I think that this conflict today proves that we are able to go past grievances and that we are able to look into the future, into the common future together.
Report in short.
This is the real Achilles heel of Putin's mobilization.
And of course, our flagship, Chain Reaction.
These two countries are interacting militarily or have been interacting in several different conflicts. And in some cases, they're on the same side, and in some cases, they're not.
New episodes are available each week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This week on Chain Reaction.
Welcome to Chain Reaction, coming to you from Tbilisi, Georgia, where we just wrapped up a two-day conference on security in the Black Sea region. The Black Sea region looms increasingly large as the locus of great power military, political, and economic competition. Russia has chosen the region as a focal point of its challenge to the Western security order, as its 2008 invasion of Georgia and its 2014 and 2022 invasions of Ukraine make clear. Geopolitically, the region is where the West, Russia, and the wider Middle East come into contact. As countries like Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia seek EU membership, Russia looks to destabilize them. Turkey aims to retain its good standing with NATO, preserve its ties with Russia, and assert its interests in the Syrian civil war. The region also holds considerable importance as an economic and energy transit zone, with the West, Russia, and China launching transportation and energy infrastructure projects there. Finally, Black Sea states struggle to build political, economic, and social resilience in the face of Russian attempts to destabilize them and subvert their sovereignty. The goal of this conference is to advance understanding among regional and Western scholars and policymakers on the challenges and opportunities in the Black Sea region. To discuss the conference and its major themes, I'm joined by a team of 6 people who represent the diverse talent FPRI brings to the table. Maia Otarashvili is the director of FPRI's Eurasia Program and was the intellectual driving force behind this conference, which brought together some 25 experts from 13 countries. Aaron Schwartzbaum is the 2023 Templeton Fellow in the Eurasia Program at FPRI and is the founder of FPRI's Bear Market Brief. He now works with Bear Market Brief team as an advisor, columnist, and podcast host. Maximilian Hess is a Central Asia Fellow in the Eurasia Program at FPRI and the founder of the London-based political risk firm Enmetena Advisory. He is also the author of Economic War, Ukraine and the Global Conflict Between Russia and the West. Nikolas Gvosdev is the editor of Orbis, FPRI's Journal of World Affairs, and a senior fellow in FPRI's Eurasia Program. He is also a professor of national security affairs at the U.S. Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. Ambassador Batu Kutelia is a senior fellow in FPRI's Eurasia Program. He's a former ambassador to the USA and former head of Georgia's Foreign Intelligence Service. Ambassador Dato Sikharulidze is a senior fellow in FPRI's Eurasia Program. He is a former Georgian ambassador to the USA and former Minister of Defense.
Maia, Aaron, Max, Nick, Batu, and Dato, thanks for joining me today on Chain Reaction. We just wrapped up 2 days of pretty intense discussions here in Tbilisi. Each of you played a key role in those discussions, so I'd like to ask each of you to give your impressions on the key insights you gained here. Maia, you were involved in the panel on NATO's role in the region. What did we learn?
Thank you, Bob. I found this panel to be really interesting and insightful. We had 4 really great speakers, and you were one of them. Much of the discussion, because of where we are, really ended up focusing on NATO enlargement and the question of Ukraine and Georgia's membership. And there, I think we gained quite a few insights. whether or not NATO partnership without membership is a useful and helpful thing, or whether it puts these states in harm's way. I thought that was a really interesting conversation. I'm going to keep using Rick's phrase, the consolation prizes in the absence of a full membership offer. I thought that was a really interesting way to kind of abbreviate the gray in between, right? But I think at the end of the day, although each of you brought something unique to the discussion, it seemed like everyone agrees that really the picture is black and white. You have membership to NATO or no membership, and no membership means no security guarantees. And at the end of the day, that's really what Ukraine and Georgia are looking for, and any other potential new NATO member. So then really the conversation is about, okay, whatever comes before membership, is it useful? Is it helpful? Where does it leave these countries? And I think, I mentioned this as I was moderating, it's frustrating. It's a frustrating conversation. I feel like it is, more of a philosophical discussion than anything else. It doesn't seem like there are any real solutions on the table to fixing this situation, and Nick used this phrase that I really liked, politicians are promiscuous in their language, right?
Right.
Again, talking about the very serious consequences of that language, I think that was very useful. Again, especially because of where we are, right? Looking at this audience in Georgia and Tbilisi, looking at them in the eyes and saying things like that, look, Ukraine will not get a membership offer in Vilnius. Those were some difficult conversations, but nevertheless, really important ones to be had. And, another one that came up was, should NATO be having more transparent and honest conversations about things like, we will not extend membership to countries that represent security liability for NATO. And if that is the case, why not speak about it a little more openly and not lead on these potential member states? So unfortunately, I felt like we had more problems than solutions in this discussion, but that's why we are here, and that's why the conversation continues. I think there is still hope that there can be some incremental solutions, and I encourage our audience members to check out the recordings of these panels. I know we don't have a lot of time right now, so I thought it was really interesting some of the solutions Rick was offering, and certainly Nick's proposal or what Nick told us about how a partnership could be structured in a way to benefit NATO and the partners a little bit more. So I recommend checking out the actual recording of the event.
Right. So thanks, Maia. Yeah, we talked a lot on the panel about the fact that some of the diplomatic niceties, some of the encouraging language from Western politicians runs into the hard reality of lack of a security guarantee and that gray zone between some sort of partnership status with NATO and membership, and how to bridge that gap. We also talked a little bit about the fact now that there is a precedent for members getting in without a map, without a membership action plan, right? So, yeah, one of my key takeaways was just that the diplomatic niceties in the language run into the hard security realities on the ground, and it leaves partners like Ukraine and Georgia with not a lot of good options between 2008, when the initial sort of Bucharest summit declaration came out and Georgia and Ukraine were on the path to membership, and 2023, where we find ourselves with neither right now seeming to have a realistic path to quick membership.
Yeah, and I think because, again, we should take this very unique context into account because of where we are sitting. I think there are, a couple of key takeaways. Sort of the hard pill to swallow here is that, we believe that Ukraine will not receive a membership offer in Vilnius in just 2 weeks, I think. That's a big one. Another one, that Georgia is nowhere near becoming a member or being offered membership by NATO anytime soon. Now, you can agree or disagree whether or not NATO should enlarge, whether or not these countries sort of deserve to be in NATO. But where we're sitting, these are countries that have been fighting and really going after NATO membership with everything they've got. So the hard conversation I felt that we had here was it's not in the cards anytime soon. Right. So I'm very pleased that there was not sort of as much awe and sort of outrage and gasping in the audience. But I think that also tells you, right? You said in the conversation, there's a NATO fatigue in Georgia. There's a Georgia fatigue in NATO, right. Or NATO fatigue in Georgia, right? So maybe this lack of panic in the audience wasn't indicative of that. People are not surprised.
Right.
For Ukraine, it's still really difficult to talk about that Vilnius may not make a very big difference for Ukraine.
Right. I think you're exactly right. I think among Georgians who are paying attention, there's no expectation of anything being granted to Georgia in Vilnius. In fact, the prime minister's not even invited, right? So we talked a little bit about the Georgia-Ukraine sort of tandem, which has really been in existence since 2008, having been broken, right? And Ukraine, whatever it gets at Vilnius, will probably not be a hard membership offer, but Ukraine has separated itself from Georgia on the path to NATO membership. And that separation may be permanent. So thank you so much, Maia.
Thank you, Bob.
Our next panel was on the EU's role in the region, and I'll turn it over to Aaron Schwartzbaum. Aaron, what did we learn about how Brussels sees the region and how the region sees Brussels?
Well, this is a great conference to be a part of. And I think this panel I enjoyed moderating because we heard really a plethora of different, if not viewpoints, angles on EU and its role, ranging from prescriptive diagnosis for how the EU can improve its regional standing and emerge as a more credible actor, down to the Georgian viewpoints on membership in the institution. And I think one of the panelists really dove in on and was explicit about is that while some of the conversation focused on kind of the interplay EU versus NATO, that to the mind of a lot of Georgians, you can't have membership in this broader European community without security guarantees from NATO. Right. So a lot of comparing and contrasting between the organizations and what it might mean to be part of one versus part of another. One of the points of debate was over whether your average Georgian would rather have visa access, economic opportunities versus security guarantees that may, outside of a war, be much more complicated for a regular person to grasp, which I think makes a lot of intuitive sense. We also focused a little bit about the geopolitics and the view in Brussels, similarly to NATO fatigue, that there may be some EU expansion fatigue, where you need the necessary overlap of the following of political will, financial resources, and an agreement about expansion. And I think actually that parallels pretty neatly with some of the considerations NATO has. I think there's a question as well of how to manage what one panelist called a de facto war zone in the Black Sea region and the complications that arise trying to expand an international organization into such a region. So I think that covers the main points of what we heard. The other kind of angle was about how, and I think this is an important one, the Georgian government is viewing the EU now and having been in kind of accession limbo for a long time. And I think similar fatigue, it parallels different ostensible purpose than NATO, but the struggles and kind of relevant pieces here are in parallel.
I wanted to ask you this. We heard a lot of discussion about the EU as a strategic actor. And what does that mean? What are we talking about when we say that?
So I think this relates to the kind of geopolitical conjuncture we're at in the world now, where the EU had been a very idealistic, ideas-based organization, a common community of democracy. But I think especially in light of what's happened in Ukraine, there's been a growing realization that politics, while ideas are great and important for the important part of the foundation of identity, politics also require strategy and military force sometimes. And I guess it's a return to more traditional statecraft as a bloc.
Right, yeah. And so to me, that strategic actor discussion parallels some of what we talked about in the NATO panel, that there are hard security realities in this region that both states and organizations that are in the region or that want to act in the region have to take into account. And so, I've been hearing about EU defense capabilities for probably 20 years now. And this is something the US is, on the one hand, welcomed as long as it doesn't take away from NATO, right? But I guess the summary I have from the first two panels is that both of these organizations are trying to deal with geostrategic, geopolitical, hard security realities on the ground, and neither of them really have a way forward. Neither of them have figured this out, and especially in this region, the Black Sea region, where you have on the NATO side, you have 3 NATO members, 2 NATO aspirants, and Russia, NATO's greatest adversary, as Black Sea littoral states. So thank you so much, Aaron, for your comments. Max, where to you? You were involved in the panel on energy security and transit. So tell us a little bit about what we learned. This is what you do for a living, right? So you're well qualified to summarize this panel for us.
Well, I'll let others judge on the qualifications, but yes, it was certainly a very interesting panel. The Black Sea region really provides a crucial point to understanding the energy security issues that Europe in particular has faced over the last year, and how we saw those through the global gas price crisis spread globally, as well as some potential solutions and alleviations and risks going forward to Europe's gas problems going forward, in particular in relation to Azerbaijan's agreement to supply an additional 5 billion cubic meters of gas over the coming years per year to the European Union.
And so we talked a lot in this panel too about the Black Sea region as an energy corridor. How realistic is that?
Well, I think that there are certain limitations to it. There has long been this hope, and this is something we really discussed and debated, how realistic it is and how feasible it may be for Turkmenistan potentially to join that supply route, the European Union southern gas corridor that runs from Azerbaijan via Georgia, where we are here today, through Turkey, and then now on to Greece, Albania, and all the way to Italy. I think there's really still a lot of geopolitical challenges there. One in terms of, Russia's threats to Caspian Sea security, the potential for Iranian involvement with the continued U.S. sanctions on Iran as well, which could potentially provide an alternative land route, but isn't really that likely. And then, of course, the security risks in the Black Sea region itself. Firstly, in the ongoing tensions between Armenia and Azerbaijan, where we were happy to report and discuss that, there has been some progress in negotiations over the last 6 months, but things certainly still remain on tenterhooks there. And then with regards to Ukraine's own position in that future, because one of the still significant transit routes into Europe for natural gas is still Russian gas that is piped via Ukraine, which is still very important. And of course, which Russia had long sought to replace via the Nord Stream routes, and then via what is known as Turk Stream as well, where they are still pumping gas, but which has limitations on its infrastructure going in. There's still so much more to discuss here. One point we didn't touch on was the recent developments in Bulgaria with their government, but that will be very important to that route, and is something that a lot of us panelists will be looking to discuss going forward. And then also with the potential for Ukraine's own strategy, and it doesn't want to continue to service this Russian gas transit when that contract ends in 2024, but the government there is looking to position Ukraine's gas hub facilities as a kind of storage battery for the European Union, which is really important because Europe lacks the necessary gas storage capacity to really be able to mitigate potential price spikes in the future.
Yeah, and what really stood out for me in this panel, and this is not news to anybody who follows this issue, but I think it bears repeating, the extent to which Russia views energy transit, energy infrastructure in sort of geostrategic terms as a tool, a security or diplomatic, as well as an economic tool, and the West views it in terms of economic viability, right? There was all this discussion about why doesn't the West build pipelines to lock up some of that Central Asian gas and lock Russia out? And of course, the answer, I think, from the panel was it's not economically viable.
Yeah, it really is the fundamental difference in the view. In the West, these gas projects are really reliant primarily on private company financing. And even then, this region has played a key role because the construction of the Trans-Anatolian and Trans-Adriatic pipelines that opened in 2020, bringing more Azerbaijani gas all the way to Europe, was really only achieved not through, although there was some support, not through Western governmental financial support, but really the support of the Turkish, Georgian, and Azeri governments, and them being willing to invest their own money there. And, Russia has a long history of weaponizing these gas supplies. We spoke briefly about how all the way going back to 2006 was the first big gas crisis that already had an impact in Europe, with Russia looking to put the pressure on Ukraine to demand lower transit fees. And, that came in the same time in the aftermath of the initial Orange Revolution. So in Russia's view and in Russia's action, it has always tied one with the other. And I think there's a belated realization. We discussed what's known as the Zeitenwende in Germany, the sort of, epochal change in the approach to Russia and the need to do it, but also that there are still real limitations there. And I think, Europe in particular and the United States in support has a long way to go to understanding these things, not just as short-term economic projects, but long-term geostrategic ones.
Right. So thanks, Max. And since you're sitting here with a copy of your new book, Economic War, I'll mention that Max does have a new book out called Economic War. So look for it wherever your books are sold.
Thank you.
Dato, we'll move to you. You were involved in a couple of panels, one on strategic connectivity and one on building resilience in regional states. So if you could just give us your impressions of those discussions.
First discussion was about the strategic connectivity. It was kind of continuity of the previous panel that we were discussing this energy. For years and decades, even decades, that we've been discussing the importance of this South Trans-Caucasian, Trans-Caspian corridor, importance of connecting larger Eurasian mass with Europe through South Caucasus that bypasses Russia. And it was all about not only energy, but also the transportation, digital informational connection, and also some other projects that we see more and more. Like last week, we've seen that Germany signing green hydrogen project with Kazakhstan, producing green hydrogen in Kazakhstan and transporting it to Germany. So the importance of this corridor was determined by largely using this energy infrastructure and transportation infrastructure by Russia to exercise its political pressure on Central Asian and South Caucasian states. And it has become more vivid. The importance of it has become more vivid after last year, after Russia launched this full-scale attack, or relaunched the full-scale attack on Ukraine. No one doubts the importance of this. But for this, we were advocating for a holistic approach.
Right.
For a holistic approach that includes not only development of infrastructure, which is absolutely essential component, but also providing security to the region through promoting Georgia's NATO membership, through strengthening democracy and democratic credentials, and of course, focusing on Georgia. If Georgia wants to become essential component, key component for this transportation route and all for the strategic connectivity, it needs to do significant progress toward democracy, significant progress toward strengthening, upgrading its infrastructure, and promoting, further promoting good governance.
We didn't get into it in the panel discussion, but a question that's been floating around in my head for the last 2 days is, to what extent is Georgia's role as a transit country, and a country important to strategic connectivity between Central Asia, Caspian Basin, and then on into Europe, to what extent is that dependent upon the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict not being resolved? In other words, if that conflict is someday resolved, does Georgia become the town that the interstate bypassed, right? In other words, do the connectivity links then go through Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Turkey and bypass Georgia? And what could Georgia do to prevent that? You mentioned strengthen its infrastructure, its democratic credentials, right? But are there other things Georgia can be doing to position itself?
Largely, of course, the Georgia's role always has been. I mean, now it's changing, and with the current government, democratic credentials have been affected, Georgia's democratic credentials. But for years, Georgia was leading the exemplary state for the democratic reforms and good governance. So I think that this is exactly the niche that Georgia should maintain. As of course, we see the more or less, I don't know, there are some worrisome developments, but also there's some positive development with regard of resolving Azerbaijan-Armenian conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh. And I think that I have no doubts about it, that what is good for Azerbaijan and what is good for Armenia, and I definitely believe that resolving this within the framework of, within the principles of Helsinki Final Act, resolving this conflict, is good for Azerbaijan and good for Armenia. And what is good for Armenia and good for Azerbaijan is good for Georgia. We are so interconnected that we must be also interconnected. So I think that in this regard, I hope for the better, the good developments vis-a-vis Nagorno-Karabakh.
And you moderated the panel on building resilience in Black Sea regional states. So what did we learn there?
Oh, the resilience is a key factor. So we are focusing mostly on this panel of the speakers. I was moderating. The speakers were focusing mostly on different components of the hybrid war that Russia is fighting, not against only its immediate neighborhood, but also beyond it. It certainly its components such as propaganda, disinformation, and corruption or corrupt practices that they are using to influence decision-making processes outside, beyond their borders, and propaganda that actually also serves largely their strategic objectives are really not less dangerous than their divisions and military hardware. So, and sometimes they can do pretty serious harm to countries, not only to democracies, not only emerging democracies, but also well-established democracies. In this panel, we recognize the importance of one way or another standing up against these kind of influences, malign influence that is the big name for different components of this hybrid war. Speaker spoke about importance and need for the better coordinated strategy to withstand this Russian influence and Russian push with these components of hybrid war.
And I think you made a key point there, and I guess this can sort of wrap up the discussion of this panel nicely. That Russia's hybrid activities, its activities, information warfare, disinformation, misinformation, propaganda, are in many ways as dangerous to regional states as its military power. Speaking of Russian military power, that brings us to the last panel, one we just wrapped up about an hour ago here, and that's on the war in Ukraine and its effect on regional security. So, Nick, you were involved in that panel. Can you summarize that discussion for us?
Well, it's the keystone panel because all the previous panels, discussions about security arrangements, security guarantees, economic development, the wild card is what will Russia's position be in this region in the future. So therefore, the outcome of the war in Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine, is going to matter a great deal. And so we structured this panel around trying to get answers to a set of questions that will help us to make some judgment calls. And the first and foremost is the assessment: is the war going to end with a stalemate? Will Russia be defeated? What will the level of Russian defeat be in terms of being pushed back or being completely expelled from Ukraine, or a defeat that then leads to fundamental change inside of Russia? Or will Russia, in fact, solidify its position in what is a war of attrition? Who will break first, in a way? That then raises the question of Western support. That Ukraine's ability to even the odds in the fight against Russia has depended very much upon a unified Western response, not just simply political support, but concrete military support, concrete economic support. How long will that continue? Will Western resolve be shaken if there are nuclear dimensions to the conflict? And if there is, whether it's a strategic nuclear weapon, a tactical nuclear weapon, a nuclear accident, will that change the extent of Western support? Will the West have to increase its involvement? And that can run the gamut, everything from more direct military involvement to really rethinking the types of arrangements it's going to give to Ukraine. And of course, one of the themes of this conference has been to try to read the tea leaves of the Vilnius summit. What particularly is NATO prepared to do and offer? What will individual NATO members be prepared to do if the alliance itself is not willing to move as a collective? And then finally, what may be the $64,000 question is the future of the Russian political system. Is it just simply that the system can endure, it will replicate itself? How long will Vladimir Putin have himself to stay in office, particularly after the recent Wagner March to Justice coup, whatever we want to call it? But also, is it a question simply of leadership transition or systemic transition? And what I thought was interesting about the panel is even when the panelists didn't agree and had different assessments, is that there was, I would have to say, a very sober assessment. One of the problems we've had, and Aaron, who was on this panel with us, this doom and irrational optimism cycles that we go through, that Russia is unstoppable, Russia's about to collapse. Ukraine is going to win this quickly. No, Ukraine is not. And this panel really tried to get at, with everyone caveating that the future is uncertain, that we really have to be prepared. And I think Olena really stressed this, that this could go on for a long time. This is not something that necessarily wraps up quickly or neatly. And then, of course, that intersects with elections, starting with the US presidential election, but other elections in the West. That may have an impact on how this plays out. And then ultimately, it has an impact on the region as a whole, because I think one of the things, and you just finished this in the discussion of the last panels, is that Russia's tools of power aren't just simply nuclear and conventional military. It has other tools, and that has an impact if you're trying to create new institutions and structures in the Black Sea region. Is Russia going to interfere with those? Is Russia incentivized to interfere with those? And so all of this ties together that the resolution of the conflict in Ukraine is going to be critical to the future of the Black Sea region.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. And to me, one of the most, maybe the most interesting part of this whole discussion on Ukraine was the last question we tackled, and that is, can the Russian system survive the strain, with the Wagner insurrection being the most recent indication that it is under strain. And so we had some disagreement. One of the panelists said, yes, it probably can. And there were several of you that were in the middle. And then, Batu, you had a very definitive answer to this question, and that was that the collapse of the Russian system is inevitable. And so can you walk us through your logic there and just tell us a little bit about why the collapse of the system is inevitable, and whether Ukraine might be the catalyst that causes the collapse, or if it will survive Ukraine and then collapse under its own weight in some future time?
Thank you very much, Bob. Yes, it was really very engaging, interesting, and in-depth discussion of these 2 days. We started with NATO and ended up with Russia panel, but actually it looked 360 behind, because these two issues will be the determining factors of how not only European security, but global security will evolve, whether we will have a rules-based order or order that will be based on the power projection or spheres of influence, etc. And therefore, my argument for Russia that is on the path in an accelerated way to the collapse relies on two components. One, Russia's history, especially Russia's history since the collapse of the Soviet Union, when Russia really made a very wrong choice to stay an authoritarian country with different alterations and different type of appetites on the way. But also this trajectory clearly indicates that every step Russian leadership made were catastrophes, different kind of catastrophes, but including invasion in Georgia of 2008, including the interference in democratic elections in the US and European countries. All of this really resulted as a catastrophe that revealed that Russia has huge internal problem of either maintaining or creating a new identity as a normal state, and therefore it swings towards the more authoritarianism. But Putin's latest decision to invade Ukraine really accelerated this process of Russian collapse because it revealed all components of the ugly nature of this authoritarian system. And also Ukrainians' brave resistance that did not allow Russia to achieve quick success, also identified these gaps within the Russian system. And now I think we see like an avalanche, an acceleration of the collapsing system. And other symptoms are indicators of it. What is happening inside Russia, this Wagner saga, and many other components. And I think that was quite a good discussion on our panel on this.
So I guess the message there is stay tuned, watch this channel, watch what happens in Russia. The war in Ukraine may be the crucible for the Russian state. It may or may not pass it successfully. So I think we'll wrap it up with that. So Maia, Aaron, Max, Nick, Batu, and Dato, thank you so much for joining me. Thanks for your time and your insights. Thanks for tuning in to Chain Reaction, a podcast of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping Europe and Eurasia. Throughout the year, we're talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, the past, present, and future of the Baltic states, Russia's political economy, and great power competition in the region. Note that the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of FPRI. I'm your host, Dr. Bob Hamilton, head of Eurasia Research at FPRI. Visit us at fpri.org for more on today's topic and many others in the world of foreign policy and national security. Thanks for listening. See you soon.